Afternoon, everyone. The human rights to water and sanitation are internationally recognized human rights, referred to implicitly in various international and regional human rights treaties. They are part of the human rights to an adequate standard of living, which is guaranteed in the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The human rights to water and sanitation are also closely linked to other human rights, including the rights to health, the rights to life, and two fundamental principles such as human dignity. At international level, there are human rights mechanisms that monitor the implementation of the rights. The Universal Periodic Review, for example, is one of the main features from Human Rights Council as international mechanism that provides opportunity for each country to declare what action they have taken to improve the human rights situation in their countries and to fulfill their human rights obligations. However, many questions come up when we refer to WAS sectors. How does such mechanism work, and how can local voices influence discussion at the global level? Simavi, a Dutch non-government organization which I have been working for almost 7 years, put human rights at the heart of our work. Since understanding them and knowing how to claim them is essential for the respect, protection, and fulfillment of these rights for women and girls, we, in collaboration with the University of Amsterdam, especially in the Amsterdam Law School, developed a lecture series on human rights. The lectures provide a 7-step journey, each between 15 to 20 minutes in understanding human rights and engaging with human rights mechanism, specifically in the Universal Periodic Review. And today, we will launch the lecture to a discussion with some speakers from different perspectives, from academia, UN organization, and GSO, about international human rights advocacy mechanism and how CSOs can use this mechanism to raise WAS issues. I definitely will share the link on the lectures at the end of the session, also with the page after the session, so you will know how the lectures going. And allow me, Angelina Yusridar Mustafa, a program coordinator of Simavi Indonesia, to be your host today and facilitate the discussion. And now the agenda for this launching session will be a fruitful discussion, I believe. We'll start with an opening word from Verly van Termaat and of Simavi in the Netherlands. She will explain a bit about shifting the power and how it is important to human rights in WAS sector. Then we will have Professor Yvonne Dunders of University of Amsterdam as a keynote speaker to dive more in depth on the lectures and give you an overview of what you can expect when watching the video of the lectures. On the panelist discussion, we have Alisa Clark from UPR branch United Nations, Judith Hoevenaars from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and Fenex Watabawa of WenMed Uganda, and lastly, we have Yahin Sams of Uttarans in Bangladesh. All of the panelists will present about human rights mechanism and how to use them practically, challenges raised during the implementation, and what kind of lesson learned that would be benefit for all of us. So before we start, I really encourage all participants to mute the microphone so there will be noise during the presentation or discussion, but I also encourage you to be participate actively by if you have question, just type the question on the chat box, or during the Q&A discussion, please raise your hand if you have question. And now, for time management, I'm inviting Verly van Termaat, the Director of Partnership Development of Simavi, to officially open the session. Time is yours, Verly.
Thank you very much, Angelina, and welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and even good evening, even especially I think also for you, Angelina. to this session. I think this is, of course, a very important day today. It's the 9th of December, so the most important day of the year, of course, comes tomorrow. So this session is at a really good moment in time in the run-up of course, Human Rights Day. Well, Angelina already explained, my name is Veerle. I have a very horrible last name, it's verloren van themaat. I work for Simavi as the Director of Partnership Development. Well, Angelina already explained, yes, Simavi is an organization based in the Netherlands, but we work globally, especially to pursue the rights for women and girls, focusing really on the rights to water and sanitation. And especially now at this moment, I think where the world is in, it is even more crucial that we talk about the rights to water and sanitation, especially also for women and girls. Yeah, there's a lot of talk, of course, globally that we are facing, and we are amidst 3 global crises. Of course, the climate crisis, the COVID crisis, but also severe human rights crisis. And these triple global crises really reinforce each other, but also have everything to do with water. And for us, of course, as Simavi, but especially I think also discussed today, the climate crisis is also a water crisis. And water plays a pivotal role in how the world mitigates, but of course, severely also adapts to the effects of climate change. I think everybody has written and read the latest IPCC report, or at least parts of it, and see that the effects of climate change are already felt all around the world and will intensify in the coming years if we don't further mitigate, of course. We also see that those who are hit hardest, low middle income countries, marginalized communities, are the ones who have contributed the least to the problems. We also see that girls and women are hit hardest by the climate crisis. Yeah, because a lot of times girls and women are responsible for fetching water, unpaid care work. We also see, for example, they really work a lot on the lands. In sub-Saharan Africa, 70% of the food production comes from women. With water being more scarce all around the world, this will hardly affect their lives and their daily living. And it will also have a severe effect if women have to intensify their work on domestic task. It will also limit themselves from pursuing economic opportunities. On the other hand, we see that women actually have a lot of knowledge and expertise and are actually at the front lines and understand the effects of climate crisis and how it affects, but also how to deal with those consequences. And that leadership and that knowledge is actually a lot of times overlooked at international platforms, those also where human rights are being discussed. But we also see that in national adaptation planning meetings, women and girls are usually not part of those discussions. In the climate crisis, and the climate crisis is a water crisis, it is so important that a lot of these unheard voices and unheard CSOs and organizations are heard. But at the other hand, we see what's happening at the globe. For example, at the last climate conference, the COP26, it was actually noted as one of the most exclusive climate conference ever. A lot of important voices, crucial voices, voices of indigenous groups, voices of women and girls, were excluded from important discussions because they were denied access. So on the one hand, we see these emerging restrictions coming all around the world. And that is also why it is so important that local CSOs, and I'm very happy to see so many participants from all around the world in this session today to discuss and to see how we can join and work together and use existing mechanisms to really hold governments to account, and especially on the limited progress that is being made on SDG 6. Well, secondly, of course, the COVID crisis is also a water crisis. And there's, in essence, not much more to say about it, because I think we all know that. And increasing needs, of course, of hand washing puts already extra on a limited availability of resources, on water resources. In some countries, we even heard reporting that literally fights were about accessing water for people to clean their hands, and that not leave alone the fight that we have now around inequality around access to COVID vaccines. But we can say that the COVID crisis also further politicized access to water, and that it also further affected women disproportionately. And while women a lot of times, and 80% are responsible for water collection, we see that they only make up 17% of the water sanitation and hygiene workforce. So there's a huge inequality about it. So those who are most affected have actually least power to actually discuss that and to be part of it and determine how it should be affected. And then I think the last and most important what we discussed today, the human rights and how they are affected, and especially how they also affect water and environmental activists all around the world. And there's a global pressure on water resources, and this will further politicize water, because water is all about who owns the water, who has the power, and who controls the water, and who also has the control over the resources. Unfortunately, we also see that such power and resources in a global water governance system are dominated by organizations in the global north. For example, like the IMF and the World Bank, they're actually really promoting the pro-water privatization agenda, which really severely jeopardizes, and I think there are a lot of organizations here that can say much more about it, about the realization of SDG 6, and in particular, universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water. In the contrast, actually, good water governance involves adhering to principles of human rights, including accountability, transparency, and participation, regulation, and the performance of water and sanitation service providers. Water is a public good, and that's why it is so important that we urge all civil society to be more active in using human rights mechanisms to really focus on water and sanitation and making sure that these commitments are being realized. We also see, and that is actually really shocking, in a report from Global Witness, I'm not sure if everybody has read it, but there's a record of number of activists protecting the environment and water and also land rights were murdered last year. Over 200 people, the highest number ever, and the number of murders perpetrated against activists struggling to protect water was even seen as threefold. So we see that on the one hand, there's an urgent need because of the COVID and the climate crisis putting on water resources. On the other hand, we also see that the repressive regimes, that activists are being put at jeopardy. Now, of course, I don't want to end this with a negative note, because I think we have to also see it as an opportunity that there are a lot of mechanisms that we can use as an official way to put and to hold governments to account. And therefore, I think it's really important for us as civil society, but also as universities, research institutes, and other academic institutes to work together and to help organizations to bring to the table there where it goes wrong, there where local communities are affected, there where human rights are not adhered to, and to bring that to the table. So I think these three global crises urge us not only to work together, but also to take it as an opportunity to really protect the human rights, especially also for women and girls, and for us to realize SDG 6, because in the end, we have still 9 years to go, and there's still a lot to achieve. So I will stop here and probably give the floor back to you, Angelina, or immediately to Professor Yvonne Donders from the University of Amsterdam, who will tell much more about the human rights mechanism, especially about the lectures that we developed together.
Thank you so much, Perle. It's such a beautiful message. We are talking about the shift of the power, how shift the power should be done collectively from stakeholder, especially in the north, and give opportunity to local GSO to lead and be heard at global level to ensure the human rights of the community are fulfilled. So thank you so much for the speak, and I like to inviting Professor Yvonne Donders as our keynote speaker in this launching session. So Professor Dr. Yvonne Donders is a professor of international human rights and cultural diversity and head of the Department of International and European Public Law at the Faculty of Law of the University of Amsterdam. She also works as a commissioner at the Netherlands Human Rights Institute. She graduated from Utrecht University in International Relations and has done her PhD at the Law Faculty of Maastricht University on Cultural Human Rights and the Right to Cultural Identity. Her research interests include public international law, international human rights law, in particular economic, social, and cultural rights, and human rights and cultural diversity. I give the floor to you, Yvonne Donders. Time is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here and to introduce to you the Simavi Human Rights Lecture Series. Now, tomorrow we celebrate, as was already mentioned, International Human Rights Day. And we commemorate that on 10 December 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came into being. And this is still one of the most famous, but also important human rights documents today, translated into more than 530 languages. Since then, many international, regional, and national legal instruments have been adopted on human rights. However, the existence of legal instruments alone has not made the world a much better place. The worldwide health crisis that we see today shows perhaps better than ever before how important international human rights law is and how much we need international cooperation in the field of human rights. Other worldwide crises, also mentioned already, such as the climate change, migration, poverty, sustainable development, also confirm that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is still very relevant today. At the same time, we see that states are not always willing to explicitly link human rights to these international crises. Since human rights are a binding legal framework, states are hesitant to connect them firmly to aspirations or goals in respect of climate change, sustainable development, or health. While the Sustainable Development Goals make a clear link to human rights, there are no firm legal commitments. In the recent summit on climate change in Glasgow, human rights were hardly mentioned. And in the global health crisis following the pandemic, developed states favor their own interest over international human rights solidarity. So these crises thereby show that international legal human rights documents are no more than pieces of paper if they are not respected and monitored. States are supposed to implement international human rights at the national and the local level, and their behavior should be monitored at national, but also at international level. And this is perhaps one of the great strengths of the international human rights system. It's composed of a set of treaties, but also of a multi-dimensional monitoring system. And in this monitoring, non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations, and human rights defenders play a very important role. Now, you may think, well, these international legal instruments, they are so far from my daily activities on the ground, so far from the people I work with. And legal, to some, sounds very complex, even boring. But let me assure you, you and your organizations can make a real difference. Your knowledge, your expertise, data, information, all of this is crucial in holding states accountable for lack of respect for human rights. While you already play an important role in advocacy and in local implementation of human rights, you can increase your role as supervisors and informants of international procedures. And with these lectures, we aim to help you in finding your way in the international human rights arena. Yes, it is an arena sometimes. We inform you about the treaties, the declarations on international human rights, about the monitoring procedures, and most importantly, about how you can play a role in these procedures. For instance, in the Universal Periodic Review of the Human Rights Council, in which every state has to regularly participate. We also show you how you can participate in the reporting procedures of the United Nations treaty bodies, independent monitoring bodies that supervise how states have implemented their obligations from these treaties. The lectures focus on several specific topics: water, sanitation, hygiene, sexual and reproductive health and rights. Topics that you work with. Topics that are clearly human rights related. But we explain in the lectures how and which human rights are involved, and also which obligations states have as regards these topics. We also pay attention to the role of non-state actors, including corporations, businesses, in the promotion of human rights. All these monitoring bodies, the Human Rights Council, the UN treaty bodies, they are dependent on your information and expertise in order to be able to properly monitor what states and non-state actors are doing, and also to be able to give states proper recommendations for improvement. With these lectures, we show you in very practical ways how and when you can present your input. After all, we know the UN has its own language, jargon, and customs, and it is best that you are aware of these rules of the game. And these lectures should certainly help you with that. It was a real pleasure to develop the lectures together with Simavi and many of the colleagues there, and with Annemarie Middelburg. She has her own consultancy on human rights and was very instructive in developing and improving the lectures. We also profited from all of your work that you're already doing in the field. And we thereby hope that the lectures will help you, but most of all, perhaps also inspire and encourage you to involve yourself in international human rights protection. I thank you very much, and I wish you a very happy Human Rights Day.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. Yes, we are very excited to see the lectures. I believe most of us are interested because of your explanation, including how then this lecture can help us to understand the current situation of human rights in our countries and how we can play a role in human rights, including the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review that you mentioned is delivered, and how GSOs around the world can use this mechanism to voice the human rights. So it's really interesting to see in the lectures. And once again, so everyone, that I will share the link for the lecture series after the session of this of today. So thank you so much, Yvonne, once again. And now we will start the panelist discussion. As I mentioned before, that there are 4 panelists to discuss and talk about human rights and their experience. And firstly, I would like to introduce Alyssa Clark. Alyssa Clark will be talking to you about the UPR and possible engagement with GSOs, and highlighting some findings of a study on recommendation related to human rights to water and sanitation in the UPR. So Alyssa Clark, time is yours.
Thanks, Angelina. I believe I'll have some support with the PowerPoint, so I'll just go through the PowerPoint now.
Yeah, sure.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to give a broad sense of how NGOs can really be engaged and how they can make an impact on the ground, but also through the system at the UN level. So I'd like to go through some of those entry points and possibilities for participation. So for the next slide, please. Okay, so these are the main points I'll go through. So just a basic introduction to the UPR, the way the process works, and what would be entry points for advocacy, how the recommendations are different and can be used differently for advocacy, how the UPR links to the SDGs, how the UPR links to water, sanitation, and hygiene, and potential partnerships that can be useful as you do the work on the ground or do the work at the international level. Some challenges you're likely to face, and some support tools that might be helpful as you face those challenges, and some overall tools that can support you in your work on human rights, and then some good practices that hopefully you can draw some inspiration from. So next slide, please. So as Yvonne just mentioned, so UPR is a mechanism of the Human Rights Council since 2008, and it reviews every member state once every 4.5 years. And it's a peer review mechanism, meaning that it's member states reviewing other member states. So member states come up with recommendations on what can be done to improve the human rights situation of the state under review. So each state will have all the other member states of the Human Rights Council weighing in on what could be done to improve the human rights situation. And that's in the form of recommendations. So it's been going through these cycles, a 4.5-year cycle since 2008, and the latest one will end in June 2022, next year. And the focus now, since the third cycle, since 2017, is on implementation. And just to give a sense of what comes out of these reviews, there's an average of 225 recommendations for every country that's reviewed at the UPR. And most of them, roughly 77%, have been supported. And supported means that they have been accepted by the government as something the government is going to work on and implement. And just to let you know, the fourth cycle begins next year in October, November. Next slide, please. So this is the main message I'd want to leave with all the NGOs today, which is how you can be part of this process. And just to note, perhaps you can go to the next slide. I'll give an overview of the process. So as you see in the circle, it begins with the actual review. So the review happens in Geneva. All the Human Rights Council members meet in Geneva. They do the review, and the state under review has roughly 3 months to let the Human Rights Council know which recommendations it's going to accept and which it is going to note. Note means they don't accept it for the moment. And then after that, it's adopted officially at the Human Rights Council that follows the UPR working group. And then that's where the real work begins. So that's when you implement the recommendations on the ground. There's a possibility to submit a midterm report as an NGO as well as a government on how the recommendations are being implemented. And then we begin the pre-session preparation of reports. And the reports are what the member states use to come up with their recommendations during the UPR review. So I just want to point out the visual on the right. So there are 3 reports that we prepare that are used by the member states when they are undertaking the review. One is the national report prepared by the state itself. Another one is the UN report, which is basically a report of all the UN mechanisms that have made a comment or recommendation on that country, on the human rights situation. And most importantly for today, the civil society or stakeholders report. So this is where we are completely dependent on you as NGOs, as stakeholders, to let us know what's going on in the country. And that can be viewed by member states to convey what needs to change to improve the human rights situation on the ground. And that's entirely drawn from you. We don't generate the information. We get the information only from NGOs. So if you can go to the previous slide, please. So I'd like to show you, if you just kind of keep the kind of circular visual just now in mind, these are the points at which you can be involved. One, to submit your own report. So like I said, we rely on NGOs to provide information. And we do not, generally speaking, get much on water and sanitation, very little. So we want especially to encourage experts and specialists on water and sanitation to provide information on water and sanitation situations on the ground. Very much would want you to do that more regularly, more in depth, and to a greater degree. Then during the actual review, so during the review in Geneva, you can attend the review, but there's no possibility to actually speak. It's only member states to member states, as I mentioned just now. And then after the Geneva meeting, as I mentioned just now, there's a period during which the member state has to decide which recommendations they're going to accept and which they're going to note or reject. And here's where we think it's important for NGOs on the ground to be involved, for them to advocate which recommendations the government should accept. So you have the power during that period to make your point about what the government could be implementing over the subsequent 4.5 years. So then at the Human Rights Council, which is a few months later, it's officially adopted, the list of recommendations that are accepted or rejected. And at that Human Rights Council meeting, you can observe, you can intervene. If your NGO has ECOSOC status, you can also make a statement. In addition to what is said by other stakeholders, you can make a statement on the situation on the ground. You can also organize parallel events, raising, highlighting the issues that you want to raise during that session. And then after the review has been officially adopted, the recommendations, that's when you really get down to practical implementation. And here it's important to monitor the degree to which the state is living up to its commitment made. So states make commitments at the international level, and they say they're going to implement these recommendations, and it's for you to track that and let us know to what degree that's actually happening, and for you to advocate for it to actually happen, because the government publicly committed to doing this. And then, like I said, there's a possibility to have a midterm report. So let's say 2 years after any review of any country, you can let us know how the implementation is going, if it's going well, if it's not going well. And then again, you begin the cycle again with another report for the next session after 4.5 years. Thanks so much. So two slides down. Great, thanks. So the other entry points, as I mentioned before, there are two kinds of recommendations. So those that the government says yes to. So it indicates political will. So in principle, it makes it easier for you to advocate and say, because you publicly agree to do this, that you can work with them to actually have it done. Noted recommendations are usually the sensitive issues that governments want to avoid. But nonetheless, we encourage you to advocate on those issues and try to ensure that they are also worked on. We also generate at the UPR a listing of all of the recommendations that come out of the UPR.
Alisa, sorry, you have 1 minute left.
Okay, thank you. I'll just drive right through. So you have different tools. So we have a listing of all the recommendations. We have a letter to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and then you can do research. So going to the next slide, please. So it links, of course, to Goal 6 on water and sanitation. And we very much support linking SDG 6 to any reporting at the Human Rights Council as well. And reciprocally, that all voluntary national reviews also reference human rights. Next slide, please. Just to go through quickly, we can just say that the General Assembly and various mechanisms have officially mentioned water and sanitation as a human rights. Next slide. So just to note that currently only 0.4% to 0.59% of all recommendations coming out of the UPR mention water and sanitation, which means there's a lot of work to do to get it as a high-level issue to be addressed. And that will largely come from advocacy on all levels, including your level, through NGOs locally and internationally. This Next slide, please. This PowerPoint will be shared, so you'll have all the detailed information, but just to let you know, the question of accessibility is the most addressed. So there's also room to look at other areas of water and sanitation, such as quality and safety. Next slide, please. And I also want to underline the possibilities for partnerships. So you won't necessarily need to act alone. You can work with the government for national development programs. You can work with UN country teams, which are encouraged to support NGOs. You can work with the donors, the countries that make the recommendations at the UPR, especially if their donors can support implementation. And then we at the UPR have a voluntary fund for implementation, which the government requests, and you can work with the government on those projects. Next slide. So we're aware of the challenges that you face, and one of them is the lack of disaggregated data on water and sanitation, political will, resources. Next slide, please. So we try to provide some support, including to have a much more structured follow-up and a much more coordinated follow-up. And to have a tracking database. And we also want to support you in terms of a human rights indicator framework. So you can go to this link. You will see indicators like the portion of the budget that addresses water and sanitation, and you can use that to monitor implementation. Next slide, please. So we have some good practices you can draw inspiration from, including in Eswatini on collaboration to advocate more clearly, to work with UPR Info, which is an NGO that works very closely to ensure impact of the UPR. And then you can do public viewings of the UPR so that there's participation and you can garner a lot of interest and engagement to move forward. Next slide, please. And then these are the tools that you can use in getting more deeply into how you can participate. So you can actually look at UN Web TV, or the webcast of all of the countries are on there. There are also handbooks on how to follow up and how to be a civil society actor around the UN. Hope this is helpful. Thank you so much. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Alisa. Wow, it's such a insightful information. I was a bit surprised with the info that less than 1% of was sector to be addressed at global high-level discussion or paper, and it is indeed a lot of homework for us to do. So thank you so much for the info, and I believe participants here, there are many questions to you, so we will get back to you with this kind of info. Now let's move to Judith Vonars, who is Senior Policy Officer at the Department Multilateral Organization and Human Rights at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She primarily focuses on the Dutch position in UN human rights fora, like the Human Rights Council and the Third Committee. She also coordinates the UPR process and support for the UN Special Procedure. She will be hearing about how the contribution of TSO and NGOs in the UPR process inform their human rights discussion with other states. So Judith, time is yours.
Thank you, Angelina, and I'm very happy to be here and to share a little bit more about how the Netherlands deals with the UPR. So in my talk, I don't have a PowerPoint, but I will just share with you first a little bit on how the Netherlands uses the UPR, and then secondly on how we cooperate with NGOs in the UPR process. First of all, the UPR is really an important tool in our human rights toolbox, because we see worldwide that the universality of human rights is under immense pressure, and an increasing number of states try to use sort of the sovereignty argument and emphasizing that, you know, it's internal affairs. Please don't criticize us on our human rights situation, because that's for us to deal with. However, the UPR is still widely recognized and accepted as a peer review mechanism, and it offers a possibility to have this open dialogue with all countries around the world. So it has its shortcomings, but it is really a valuable instrument. The Netherlands intervenes in every single UPR review, so for all countries around the world. Not only because we think the UPR is important, but also because one of the objectives of the UPR is to treat all countries equally. So we intervene for our neighboring countries, for Belgium, for Germany, and we intervene for, you know, Burundi or whatever country around the world. In our statement, we always try to start with a compliment, which is not always easy, as you can imagine. Sometimes it's almost impossible. Then we continue with naming some areas where we really want to see some improvements. And then we come to the recommendation, so the most important part of the intervention. And the Netherlands makes 2, maximum 3 recommendations for each country. Again, this is decided to treat everybody equally. So you can imagine, for example, in the next UPR cycle in January or February, Syria is on the agenda. And you can imagine if I talk to our country desk officer Syria saying like, hey, please write this statement and make 2 or 3 recommendations. The first thing he or she says 2 or 3, come on, I can make 10 or 20, or, you know, if you give me some time, I can even think of 50 recommendations. But we only make 2 or 3. So it's sometimes really a tough choice on which topics we decide to make a recommendation. This decision for 2 or 3 recommendations is also because in many of the UPR reviews, a state only has 1 minute and 5 seconds for an intervention, which comes down to sort of 160 words if you talk relatively fast. So, you know, there are limitations on what you can do in the UPR, but we try to really make the most of it. Then another point where what is important for the Netherlands is that we really try to make our recommendations actionable. So, for example, we don't recommend like, oh, could you please improve gender equality on all fronts? Because our state will most likely support that recommendation and you know, can probably quite easily argue in the next 4 years, like, yeah, we did improve. That's a recommendation that's hard to track. However, if you make a very concrete, actionable, like a smart recommendation, for example, I looked up an example where we recommended to adopt a comprehensive gender equality law that contains a definition of discrimination against women in accordance with CEDAW. So that's very concrete. And then you can, if such a recommendation is supported, you can enter into a dialogue with a state like, please, could you concretely follow up on that recommendation? Maybe another point to mention is for the Netherlands, sometimes we try to think of whether it's strategic to make a recommendations that will most likely be supported versus a recommendation that is really tough and really, you know, where we really make a point about our concerns about the human rights situation in a specific country, but maybe the chances are high that the recommendation will only be noted. Because if the recommendation is supported, you can, you know, try and follow up. If a recommendation is noted, you can still, of course, try to follow up, but it's harder because the government basically told you like, yeah, no, we're not going to do anything with it. So sometimes it's strategic to think of a formulation where another government is more likely to support it. On cooperation with CSOs. First of all, it's super important for us. You are super important for us because the UPR interventions are written by the country desk officers, and they, of course, have a pretty good understanding of the human rights situation in a country. At the same time, if we want to make super concrete recommendations, for example, about amendments or improvement of certain laws, that is information that is not always accessible to country desk officers or to diplomats. Because in certain countries, laws are only written in the local language. Or it's so specific that we just don't have the capacity to track all pieces of legislation. So the input by CSOs is really important for our information position. In essence, I think there are two important ways for CSOs to influence the Netherlands and probably also other countries in our UPR statements. First of all, through briefings. In quite some countries around the world, UPR briefings are organized, sometimes facilitated by the EU delegation. And that's just, an informal gathering where CSO come together with diplomats and talk about what should be the thematic priorities during the UPR. And the Netherlands really listens to
Judith,
this.
one more minute. Sorry.
Yes. Thanks, Angelina. Second avenue to influence us is through reporting. I mean, Alisa already mentioned that there is this CSO report. And to be really frank with you, our country desk officers usually read the CSO report and not so much the country report submitted by the country under review. Because generally in those reports, the conclusion is like, yeah, everything is going fine. We don't need any more recommendations. So the civil society report generally is much more interesting to read. And in addition to that CSO report, we also receive reports from specific NGOs and on specific themes, and we also read those. So reports are very much welcomed. And in some reports, CSOs actually offer already recommendations, which sometimes we think like, oh, that's actually a pretty good recommendation. Copy paste, there it is. So, sometimes we like to be a bit lazy. Let me see if I still wanted to make a final point. Well, I think those are the main points that I wanted to share with you, but I'm happy to take any questions during the Q&A. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Judith. It's really, really interesting points from you that, I think it's also connected to what Alisa mentioned previously, the challenging of just having 3 recommendations for each country is really challenging, and it's part of the challenge in advocacy. So what the government of the Netherlands did, UPR briefing, CSO briefing, is really great. It's just, there are many challenges that we believe still exist and needs to be addressed. So thank you so much for the points and information. But it's really interesting because we have heard from the UN side and now from the government side. Now we will go to the CSO perspective. I would like to introduce Fenex Watebawa. So Fenex is a veteran journalist who has been practicing environmental journalism for 2 decades. He works as a television reporter and was the producer for a weekly segment Earthlink on the defunct WBS television. In his own word, he is not a professional environmentalist, but is very passionate about environmental issues. Fenex is the team leader for Water and Environment Media Network Uganda, or WEMNET, an organization that advocates for good governance in the environment and both sectors. Fennec was last year, September 2020, arrested and jailed while leading journalists on a fact-finding mission to save a tropical rainforest of Bugoma, GVR, which is being converted into a sugarcane plantation. I now take a pleasure to invite him to share with us more about how Femnet brings water issues to the forefront in its involvement with human rights mechanism, but also about success, risks, and challenges that comes with it. So time is yours, Fenex, and yeah.
Hello, we're just putting, we are trying to put the picture well for you to listen, but I'm glad that I'm here to share our perspective as WEMNET. Like Angeline has rightly introduced me, I would request that they put the PowerPoint so that we can go on. And I think because time is limited, we shall not go into the details of the PowerPoint. So can I have the PowerPoint?
Sure. Oops. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. I think the first scroll so that people can see what our title is. We are discussing issues about WEMNET, looking at water and sanitation. Should it be a human rights concern? Challenges, recommendations, and then conclusion. Next. I think you can just move those faster because they will get our PowerPoint, so they will be able to read about us. Yeah. Definitely, we're a network of journalists that are passionate about environmental issues across Uganda and in East Africa. Next. Of course, we are a registered organization, and details can be found on our website, which is on the page. So I can ask for next page. Yes. The gist of the issue is why water is a human rights concern. And of course, many of you are conversant with the UN system. We talk about access to safe water and sanitation as a human right. And we say water is life because every living organism or even factories and so many things rotate around water. Sorry. Yeah, when you look at water, we also look at the disease burden. For example, in Africa and Uganda in particular, the biggest huge budget is spent on treating diseases that are water and sanitation related. So there's no question about that if we make it a human right and we access safe water, the disease burden will definitely go down. We have water as a source of insecurity. Sometimes you will find that there's transboundary water accesses. There's where water bodies are drying up and people are moving through trekking for water, and you find them interfering with other people. At the end of the day, it causes conflict. It can also cause insecurity. You've seen the case of Egypt and Ethiopia. Then there's wastage of production time, especially among women. The working time in Africa, women trek long distances during the valuable time where they would be doing productive work, especially gardening is not going on. A lot of things stop because they still travel kilometers in search of water, be it safe or unsafe. So water remains an important thing. And lastly, looking at the pandemics like COVID, the first point of concern was that people should be availed with water and soap. So water is a catalyst almost of everything. Can go to next page. Next slide. Pushing water agenda to the UPRM. Of course, we started with the point of media exposure. How did you come to know about UPRM? We have been reporters for a long time, and we were introduced to the UPRM as early as 2016. And we saw an opportunity in the UPRM mechanisms as a way of bringing the governments to respond to issues of concern. And so we kept on pondering, because we looked at what does the media do? What is the role of the media? And we did, of course, our part, but at national level, things were not going through. So, because at some point, if you look at the second point, we through our writings and civil society organizations, we very much worked with politicians. For example, when the first tax on water was introduced, the 18% tax, we worked so much hard to fail it. And when it returned back on the floor of parliament, politicians had changed their mind. Nobody knows why. And a tax was levied. So we were left with, we saw that politics was not a very big opportunity, though it's very important in deciding the country's politics and regulations and implementation of laws and so on. We have also tried the judicial system. The judicial system seems to be knowing or not even appreciating so much issues of sanitation, and we have tried to engage the courts by bringing up cases which talk about access to safe water, access to clean water, safety of the water body sources, and so on. And we have lost these cases. So it's this reason that we looked at UPR. Looking at UPR, we looked at how countries are reviewed. We looked at the hard questions asked at the UPR, and we looked at how countries can make promises, despite the fact that they sometimes say the workable and the unworkable, but at least when they are asked on why they are not ratifying on protocols that they have signed, we thought UPR would be the best. So we looked out for the Coalition of Human Rights Defenders, who are working on the civil society human rights report. And
sorry,
said, hey,
Phoenix, but 1 minute left.
Oh, so yes, we tried to engage with the Coalition of Human Rights Defenders and tried to ensure that issues of water and sanitation become part of the review mechanism for Uganda. And it took a lot of convincing for it to be in the civil society report. And we thought WASH, and we still believe that WASH has to be part of it. So in our conclusion, maybe since I have less time, next slide in the conclusion, we do request the civil society organizations for the case of Uganda to look at making a formidable team and leading the WASH Alliance together with UASNet in Uganda to look at access to water as a human rights issue and make a path to ensure that Uganda takes this as a serious matter and should be at international level. Human rights defenders tend to be looking so much on issues of arbitrary arrest. They look at torture and other areas. And engagement or discussions must continue to ensure that water becomes a human rights issue, because you'll see in Uganda, we are now having children who are getting pregnant, who have either been raped or fell into trap during their time in searching for water, which is still not accessible within their vicinity. So I think much can be shared through, if you shared that our PowerPoint to the rest, and we could entertain more questions and answer some issues that we may not have raised. But UPR is the way to go for countries that are developing, for countries that are not compliant with protocols that have been ratified to and still remain on paper. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Fennec. Thank you for sharing what you did in Uganda, and the challenge comes up during the implementation and during your contribution on the UPR. It's really, really insightful. Yes, like you said that we have limited time. So yeah, I hope that there are many questions in the chat box. So hopefully there are many information that we can share during the Q&A. I also would like to inform the participant that the complete PowerPoint presentation from Alisa and also from Fennec will be made available on our Simavi website. So don't worry. So you can refer back to the information shared by the panelists. So I would like to continue to Yahin Sham. So Yahin Sham Shakar is a program development specialist. Yahin joined Utaran as an intern back in 2014 under its climate and water governance program, and over the years moved up the rank to become program development specialist and leading two of Utaran's program, the climate change and water governance and disaster and humanitarian action. He was Chevening Scholar in 2016 to 2017 and finished his master's on climate change and international development from the University of East Anglia. Yahin will talk to us about Utaran's involvement in human rights mechanism and provide a review of the human rights lecture series, and that he has the opportunity to already watch this week. Yahin, thank you so much for joining this session. Couple questions to you, but I think the first one would be, maybe you can say about who Utaran is, what you do at Utaran, and the focus of the work of Utaran.
Thank you, Angelina, for your question, and good evening, good afternoon to everyone who's watching this again one more time. So Utaran is a right-based NGO established in 1985 in the southwest coastal region of Bangladesh. We have worked over the last 36 years to establish human rights for the coastal people of Bangladesh by using a people-centered and a right-based approach. We have always taken local human rights issues and worked on it rather than it is being prescribed by NGOs and donors. Two of our major work, thus, is very local. One is the land rights issue in Bangladesh and the water governance issues. Our land rights program, under which we mobilize landless people so that they are able to claim their rights on public land, as we call it in Bangladesh, caste land, which are often illegally occupied by political leaders and other local thugs. This is really difficult because you're taking land out of someone who's illegally occupying it. Similarly, we also work on water right to participate so that locals can participate and strengthen the local governance systems, like my previous colleague from Uganda shared. And we, along with the local people, we advocate for a sustainable water management solution to solve some of the ecological problems in southwest coastal Bangladesh. It is very known within the Dutch water sector. It's called tidal river management. And we also work with local CSOs and other NGOs like us to advocate on the right of potable water. For example, we've been currently working with Simavi and a lot of other NGOs for the last 4 years on the price inequality of water from the rural areas and to the urban areas. From the rural areas, where I stay, I pay €6 for just only drinking water. But in the urban areas, when I used to stay in the Dhaka, I used to pay only €4 for my all-purpose water, for my daily life, everything included. So we are working on flagging these issues in various sectors.
Thank you so much, Yahin. So I would like to know, have you used human rights international mechanism in the past within Utaran, of course?
Yes, we have, but not directly. First of all, we have used it on civic rights issues. We worked with Amnesty International back in 2013 So before the election in 2013, there was huge political violence, which resulted in attack on minority people. So we provided data from the Southwest on how minority people were being attacked or were subjected to violence before the election to Amnesty International, which they have used as a report and submitted as a shadow report to the UPR system. And also in 2018, we worked for the election monitoring and also provided data on it. But it is a bit difficult for NGOs like us to access or use the UPR because we are very localized NGOs directly. So I'm sure I learned a lot from it from today, from all the presentations, but it is a bit difficult.
Yeah, you mentioned that the challenge because the Uttaran is very local NGOs, but maybe would you like to elaborate more about the challenge or what prevent Uttaran from submitting NGO contribution to the UPR or other mechanisms since 2013 or 18?
All right. So first of all, you have to understand that the political democracy in Bangladesh is generally intolerant. Thus, such reports are sometimes considered as critiques of government, or sometimes considered as tools to destroy the image of the country in front of the whole world, making it very, very difficult. Second, local NGOs and CSOs are very marginalized in Bangladesh. Like I can give you an example when our executive director was arrested in 2007, and one of the reasons was that he mobilized, and it was mentioned in his detention order that because you are mobilizing landless people to claim their rights over land, the state is happy to announce 1 month detention for you, and making it hard for local NGOs and CSOs as well. INGOs generally are more connected with the mechanism since they have big offices in Dhaka and they are more connected to the UN mechanism than local NGOs because we receive funding from INGOs then to local NGOs. So making that gap a bit harder. So, but they do gather data from us, but since they have the better capacity in organizing and writing these reports and making our access, thus making our access and participating to the UPR mechanism a little hard. Many of us probably haven't heard the UPR mechanism before this, or even if they heard, they thought this is not for us probably. So that's what makes it challenging.
Oh, wow. So if I summarize, Uttaran has taken part in the UPR some years ago, but now with the political intolerance, like you said, it makes more difficult to work on human rights publicly. But if I'm not mistaken, Uttaran have published a lot of on human rights to water and sanitation in Bangladesh, on SDGs, and with work with some NGOs. Say that there are many publications that already made by Uttaran on the issue. What do you think about that? Like you mentioned about the challenge, but also at the same time there are many work you have done.
First of all, WASH in the UPR is very new to us. We thought that UPR is mostly for civic rights. So before I was invited here, I went on to see the latest UPR report that Bangladesh government produced, and I found only 2 paragraphs on WASH. One is on the first paragraph talks about that on 97% people have access to water, but it definitely doesn't talk about if it is affordable, if it is equitable, if it is if it has safety, if it has all those issues. So we actually, it's in the UPR, WASH is not, as Elisa mentioned before us, it's not very prioritized by a lot of NGOs. So it was not prioritized for us until. So secondly, WASH is a service that we NGOs tend to provide. Like we build up WASH facilities, we build up water options for people, sanitation options, we provide them. But since we started working on this project with Simavi 3 years ago, we took a different approach. We started highlighting that WASH is also human rights issues, and it is a human rights issue, which with the approach of the NGO, the mindset, it's deeply embedded that it is a service-based issue rather than an HR issue. Secondly, we also lack the capacity, the orientation on or how to access UPR mechanism, and I think, and that is why I believe that today's lectures and the presentations would be a good use for many NGOs and CSOs working on this. We only just thought that UPR is actually for civic and fundamental rights, But when you talk about when your UPR says you have 97% access, and where I live, I pay huge amount of money. That doesn't mean I have equal access. That doesn't also mean I have equal like it's affordable. Maybe for me, I work in an NGO, I get paid a lot, but not for someone who's not in an NGO. He doesn't get paid a lot, or she doesn't get paid a lot. And maybe for someone who has to walk 5 to 7 kilometers. And we did a report that women in where we work spend 18% of their lifespan on just collecting drinking water. So maybe not for them.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Yahin. I actually also have, sorry, I think I have feedback on my voice. Is it clear now?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Yahin. I mean, like, I actually also have a lot of questions to you, but I also want participants here to really engage with the session. So I see a lot of people have send the question on the chat box. So thank you so much for your information, Yahin. It's really insightful. Now we come to the Q&A session, and I think it's really important to have, the perspective of UN organization. Alisa mentioned about the process of how we can participate in the UPR process, and we also hear from the Judith how actually UPR widely recognized and accepted because it is valuable instrument, and how the Netherlands are engaging GSO by conducting UPR briefing, GSO gathering to really get an input for the improvement. Also from FENEX, we see a lot of opportunities by conducting media exposure and collaborating with the human rights defenders, but also we see a lot of challenges happen in Uganda. And like Yahin said, it's really interesting how Uttaran works in human rights, even though political intolerance in Bangladesh is still happening. But I think it's, there are many things to do. There are many opportunities, even though there are some challenges. So thank you so much for the panelists, but it is not finished yet, because now we come to the question and answer session. So lovely participant, if you have questions or queries, I know there are some question on the chat box. Please be straightforward and time conscious. I'm now inviting for all of you who want to speak up, maybe one or two participants who really wants to speak up before I go to the chat box. If there is any question that needs to be delivered directly, because maybe some of you may not able to text, but want to ask directly to the panelists. Just raise your hand so I can unmute you. Otherwise, I will go to the chat box. I see a lot of questions here, but because of the limited time, I will not go for all the questions. So my colleagues will help me, and because I also know that some questions have been already answered in the chat box. So, but I see one very good question from Sabiha Siddiq. Do any of the panelists have any successful example of UPR recommendation adapted and being monitored continuously? If so, how was the response from the government? I think this question for all of the panelists, maybe Judith from the government or Alisa from the UN. You have experience about this.
Well, I can
answer
this question. Okay, yes, Alisa, you go first.
I was just quickly saying it's been difficult to track, but we do have some cases we can mention in particular that are linked to our voluntary fund, because there we do actually choose recommendations that are implemented through projects at the request of government. So there would be a direct result there. There's also the case, I think it was in Mongolia, where there was a new law that was directly on business and human rights. I think that was directly linked to intervention at the UPR level. So there are cases that we can point to in terms of results from the process. And we are much more now trying to do that more systematically, getting those examples of impact.
Okay, Judith, you have additional information on that?
Well, maybe a few words on how we follow up on UPR recommendations that we make to states. Because we definitely try to track how a government deals with our UPR recommendations. We include the topics of the recommendations in all our human rights dialogues, in the EU human rights dialogue. So once we make a recommendation, we really try to continue remind the government about basically the promise they made that they will follow up on a certain recommendation. So for 4.5 years, a UPR recommendation is basically sort of a policy priority for that country, for the Netherlands.
Wow, okay. Thank you so much, Judith and Alisa. I see someone is raising hand, Sabrina Kajoli. Sabrina, would you like to unmute yourself, and can you introduce yourself, like your organization and our country, so we know, please.
Good morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Sabrina Kajoli, and I currently volunteer for local and national civil society organizations on the right to water and sanitation for Guadeloupe, which is a French Caribbean territory from which I'm speaking to you right now. I would like to thank warmly all the panelists for their various perspectives about the UPR and also other human rights mechanisms at the international level. I'm fully convinced about the fact that the UPR is a very valuable instrument and very efficient one. However, we have mentioned a little bit in this discussion already that it has also limitations, and a core limitation probably is the fact that it's a non-binding instrument, which makes it a little bit challenging when a state is not necessarily willing to advance WASH issues. In our case in Guadeloupe in particular, but also at the greater level of France mainland, on WASH issues, France tends to, in its legislation, practice, and courts, to say that the primary responsibility of WASH issues does not lie with the state, but at the subnational level, because it has delegated that competence at the subnational level. So it makes it very difficult to have effective remedies. And when we take up the issue at the international level, we've obtained, for instance, recently the issuance of 5 UN special rapporteurs who issued a communication on access to safe drinking water in Guadeloupe, including the special rapporteur on access to water. France just ignored that communication and to date has not even responded to the questions raised about this issue. So I'm wondering, how can we manage to overcome the non-binding limitation of the UPR mechanism? Is there in particular a bridge that can be made with more binding instruments, such as the treaty bodies that have been mentioned by one of the panelists, and that perhaps can also contribute to support the effective implementation of the recommendations under the UPR?
Yeah,
thank you very much for your attention. How about you?
Thank you, Sabrina. So if I can summarize, it's how can we really engage with the government how can we advocate government so that they can commit to the recommendation? I think
ensure accountability.
Yeah, I think we can go to Yahin or Phoenix first, and then we can go to Judith or Alisa to confirm. How can you advocate at least in Uganda or in Bangladesh, so that the government can commit to the recommendation that provided?
It's a very difficult question because of the fact that it's about political willingness, and the political willingness comes from a fair democratic ground. So having said that, it is very important for civil society organizations to keep on knocking. We have to be persistent, and we have to be like leeches. I'm not sure that, I'm sure that's not a very nice comment, but you have to be like leeches. So you have to stick to it. We started working, I'll just give you one example. So back before, when the UPR was a big issue, there was a event happening in Bangladesh through the 90s. We advocated for human rights, on land rights, for 15 years before 1 acre of land was distributed in Bangladesh to landless people. 15 years it took. So it is a matter of persistence. It's also a matter of gathering tools, gathering evidence, and supporting government. Not always, you have to remember that if you keep on presenting yourself as an opponent of what the government is doing, they're not going to listen to you. If you present yourself as someone who wants to facilitate what you are actually doing on the ground to help you out, then probably your door's open. So that those lines, those words, how you word them, how you not to hurt their egos are very important, to ensure that we get what we want to do.
Thank you so much, Jahin and Sabrina, but I would like to go to Alisa if you have something to add after Jahin.
Yeah, sure. And I think it's a very important question. It's a political process. It's member states speaking to member states. And often it's couched in language that is diplomatic. So it may not even be hard-hitting, it may not be specific, it may not really be even intended to get results. It's a political process. So that's, I think, one of the main frameworks within which you should view the UPR, which is not to say that it's without teeth. I mean, a lot of what the UN does, it's naming and shaming. No, we don't really have, even though international law is binding in itself, I mean, to hold governments to account at the political level is a very ambitious task. So it should be read with that framework in mind, and we rely, as much as we understand that it is a challenge and maybe even jeopardy for local CSOs, we rely very much on CSOs to continue to put the pressure at the local level, as Jahin was saying, all of the time, regularly. We can put pressure at the international level. Other member states can put pressure to the degree that they view it's in their national interest to do so. So it's quite a complicated array of dynamics and power considerations, but it's not to say that it's without merit. You can use it as an instrument to bring certain issues to the fore, and that in itself is kind of spotlights the government to the degree that they may feel that they may need to do something.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Alisa and Yahin. Yeah, it's really challenging, but I think it needs a lot of hard work together in collaboration with many stakeholders. We cannot do that with one CS or two, but I think we have to with more collaboration. Well, ladies and gentlemen, many questions may not be accommodated in this session, but we believe that many questions can be answered by watching our human rights lecture series. My colleagues will send the link on the chat box, so you can see it is now shared by Lenka. So yeah, you can click on the link on the chat box. And if you are interested in collaborating or knowing more about the lectures and human rights, then please keep in touch with us. And all of your questions on the chat box or your curiosity, then it's actually answered in the lectures. because some really are. We believe that. So yeah, really thank you, especially to our wonderful panelists and also to the University of Amsterdam. Thank you so much, Yvonne Donders. I know you are already left this meeting, but thank you for the keynote speech. And I would like to thanks Middelburg Human Rights Law Consultancy, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, Uganda Human Rights Commission, and special thanks to Morilio Williams for their involvement in the event and the online lectures. Lastly, if you are interested in the discussion today and want to learn more about misconception on the human rights to water and sanitation, again, beside clicking the human rights lecture series, you can also join a podcast series made by the Make Rights Real Consortium. Next week on 17 December, there are one episode will focus on human rights to water and sanitation misconception. Hannah will send the information about that, our colleagues. So yeah, I think on the chat box as well, my colleagues already shared the link to the podcast. And general thanks to all the participants, NGOs, CSOs, and partners in Asia, Africa, in Europe, who joined this session. Thank you so much for coming and for your participation. I'm Angelina Yusudar Mustafa is signing off. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.